It has been 50 years since the landmark Supreme Court decision in Gideon versus Wainwright occurred, which ruled that states under the 14th Amendment must provide counsel to criminal defendants who could not afford a lawyer. 50 years after Gideon, most courts ignore the constitutional right to counsel by inadequately funding equal representation.
Maybe. It depends what bias is defined as, because there's definitely inequity in wealth, which determines your defense, how good your defense will be. So if you're poor, automatically you're going to have a disadvantage, period.
I do think there is bias in the legal system. It doesn't set itself up for the lower socioeconomic class to understand their rights or to actually understand that having a public defender is not your best defense.
Yes. If you're poor and a minority, the system is much harsher towards people that don't have resources, and a lot of times minorities fall into that category, and they fall prey to a legal system that's weighted.
The government has an obligation to provide adequate civil legal services for the poor, who would otherwise lack access to lawyers to resolve problems. Only 24 states have public defender systems, and even the best of those are hampered by lack of funding and crippling caseloads. Defendants too poor to post bail can spend months in jail waiting for a lawyer to be appointed.
The poor are appointed lawyers from the local bar who are often unprepared and underpaid. Without a state public defender system or resources to obtain adequate legal representation, they often face deeper consequences than they could have gotten with a more experienced defender. Many defense lawyers call no witnesses or fail to present any defense. Some fail to make closing arguments. Few object to clear constitutional error, and most are reluctant and unwilling participants in a trial process.
It's fair and uniform if you're educated and understand your rights and have money to pay for a defender, or get a contingency defender where they only get paid if you win or get off to pay them. But if you don't know your rights and you're not well off, then it is skewed to make you go to jail. If you look at it, there are so many more white people that commit crimes that don't go to jail compared to the amount of black people that commit crimes and do go to jail, or other minorities. So it is interesting to see that.
No, but just because of what we've been talking about, this if it's uniform, then justice will have kind of a smooth line going across if you were drawing it on a graph. But there are many peaks and valleys because of these variations on just the topic that we're talking about and the implementation of laws around it.
Yeah. Well, because you can have a lawyer, you can defend yourself, you can... Yeah, and there are laws. I think pretty much you have a good shot at it.
The winds are kind of blowing in the direction of racial profiling, but it may be at its peak now, where the tide might turn. I think it's a bad policy. I think that racial profiling pits bias law enforcement officials against people that they view in a certain way. And so no matter what they're doing, that profiling, that tendency to profile them puts them in a situation where they may make mistakes in so-called enforcement.
The percentage of cars pulled over with New York plates heading towards New York, cars pulled over with Florida plates heading towards New York that have guns or drugs in them is like 70%. So cops, if you went to college and I told you could take a class and get a 70 in it by just signing your name, I'm pretty sure all of you would do that. Right now you're in high school and you're kind of nerdy, so you think, no, I don't want to not go to school and do that kind of stuff. But the truth is, in college, if you were told you get a C, you would take it. So these cops are taking it easy out. They see it and they take it. You can reverse that, though. You see a bunch of white kids in the hood driving around in a car. What are they doing? They're buying drugs. And you pull them over, and 90% of the time, they have drugs in the car. So racial profiling works both ways. I don't think it's fair. The ACLU fights that. They talk about racial profiling all the time when you do sobriety checkpoints because there's no rhyme or reason to a sobriety checkpoint. So I can see where there's bias in that.
Stop, question, and frisk is a New York Police Department policy wherein police can detain, question, and potentially search pedestrians if they have a reasonable suspicion that the pedestrian in question committed, is committing, or is about to commit a felony or misdemeanor. The NYPD's stop and frisk practices raise widespread concerns over racial profiling, illegal stops, and privacy rights.
Yes, I mean, and I also agree with sort of semi-profiling people because you have to in the real world. I mean, you know, you're going to have an 80-year-old lady at an airport getting frisked versus somebody that might look more Arabic. I would probably do the Arabic-looking individual just because more likely, by percentage, they might be carrying something or trying to do something that an 80-year-old lady would not be doing. So I think in the real world, in the world we live, you have to do some sort of profiling no matter what scenario. And of course, on the streets of New York, if you're in a gang-infested area, you're going to stop and frisk people for weapons in that area. I mean, that's just common sense, you know, if you're in a bad neighborhood where there's heavy-duty drugs.
It's a wasted effort. What it does is it puts law enforcement in a situation where they are pitted against those minorities that we're talking about because of that bias. And if the profiling emphasis continues with stop and frisk, then many more innocent people will be unfairly subjected to bullying by law enforcement in the New York City area.
Last one, as a citizen.
So in general, the stop and frisk law is to protect police officers who need to ask people certain questions who fit descriptions or profiles in which they're trying to do, and you're just supposed to pat the person down and ask, or just supposed to pat the person down for protection purposes. You don't want to ask somebody a question like, hey, what are you doing here, and get stabbed in the throat. Like, that's awkward. So instead, you're just going to stop and frisk. Now, they do find drugs a lot, which is why you're probably asking that question, because people get angry about their privacy being invaded. Most of the time, the police that find the drugs will just discard them because it's hard to get into court, but it's called plain feel. So if a cop grabs you and says, what is this? First of all, you say, it's not my jacket. And then you would say, that's not my weed. And he would say, okay, then I'm just going to take it. But he has to call out what it is before he pulls it out. And that's what a lot of the arguments come into plain feel and stop and frisk. Stop and frisk are only designed to protect officers. That's it. I think it's ethical to protect our police officers. I don't see a problem with not being shot in the face or stabbed or things like that, hit with a pipe while you're trying to ask a guy if he... That's where it comes to a lot of confusion, you know. You're just looking for someone who may have broken into a home, and instead this guy has 5 warrants on him, and he's going to stab you in the throat the first chance he gets. So I do believe that it would be ethical to search for weapons. Not for drugs, though, because that's, like, private.
African American and Latino communities are the overwhelming target of stop and frisk tactics. Although blacks make up 25% of New York City's population, they account for 53% of the stops. Hispanics make up 29% of the population and account for 31% of the stops. And whites make up 33% of the population yet account for only 10% of the stops. Since its implementation in 2002, millions of individuals have been stopped and questioned. Every year since, at least 80% of those stopped were completely innocent. This data brings into question whether the few instances of proven illegal activity are worth the violation of privacy and rights.
It's random to be picked for jury duty, but it's definitely skewed when you get put on a jury because they're going to try to put the best people available for their client. Like when they have, there's all kinds of jury consultants out there whose whole job it is to pick a jury best for your client. And of course, on the other side, you're trying to pick a jury best for the prosecution to prosecute the offender or defendant, if you want to say it that way. So it can be skewed depending on how high profile the case is. If it's a low profile case, then I do believe it's just totally random. If you have a good defense attorney, maybe he'll try to set the jury up for you, but in the most cases, it's not. Most people in jail in minorities, a lot of them are drug cases. A lot of them have bad public defenders or didn't know that they could go to trial. They just took a plea because they thought that they were guilty or no one believed them if they weren't guilty. But unfortunately, 70% of men in jail have been molested. So there's a lot of hidden crime that goes on, and people don't seem to, they always focus on drugs or other things, but if you would focus on the crimes that got the people there, that might lead us to have less people in jail.
Staying in jail, I'm sure, isn't necessarily something that rehabilitates people per se, because you can just be angry and frustrated, and so no, I would say probably not.
I would say they're ineffective. I mean, I know some of the boot camps they have work better with because it puts them through a program. So some of those boot camps they have down south actually work better than the typical, juvenile imprisonment, when they put them in prison. So it really depends, what they're using.
Recidivism is the tendency to return to criminal behavior after a previous conviction. According to the Department of Justice, 30% of offenders released from prison return within 6 months, and 67% return after 3 years. Currently, 35% of new prison admissions are repeat offenders. Recidivism is especially common among those below the poverty line as a result of unemployment and returning to crime-ridden areas. Today, it's very hard for ex-offenders to re-enter society. Upon release, they have no job, and many lack the skills necessary for obtaining one. 65% of employers won't even hire someone if they know they have been in jail, and many states have laws banning former inmates from certain professions. They cannot escape the life of poverty and may return to committing crimes to get by. However, if the justice system gave out more effective punishments geared towards rehabilitation, we could begin to see the recidivism rates go down. Several states have already started doing this. In 1994, a voter referendum in Oregon mandated that all prisoners must work at least 40 hours a week. Not only did this decrease the cost of prisons, but the state also saw a 22% drop in recidivism among parolees in only 5 years. If this system was instituted nationwide, we could potentially decrease both our recidivism and unemployment rates. Everything contains bias, whether we want it to or not. The justice system is no exception. Being a minority or living in poverty can put you at a disadvantage when it comes to the law, but all hope is not lost. By ending intentional bias, such as racial profiling, and working to provide those in poverty with fair defense and effective rehabilitation opportunities, we may be able to eradicate some of the inequality in our justice system and truly reach the level of fairness we wish to achieve.